Like to introduce my good friend and author, Pat Libby. Pat, you can just click to the next slide.
Okay, except it's not going. Let's try this. Wow. There we go.
So Pat is the founder of the Nonprofit Institute at the University of San Diego. She is a longtime change agent and consultant. She worked as a lobbyist while serving as a not-for-profit CEO in her hometown of Boston, which was an experience that led her to develop, refine, and teach the lobbying model that's described in the Lobbying Strategy Handbook, second edition, which we just released at Oxford University Press this past fall. Pat, you can take it away.
Well, and we've gotten the results from your poll, which is fascinating because it seems like about 70% of you have taught or currently teach a course in public policy and advocacy. Today, we're going to talk about the Libby lobbying model, the 10 steps, and how the steps in the book can be used to teach a course in applied lobbying, and the students will work on a campaign either at the local level or the state level. And I'm going to describe how I've done that for a long time. So the wonderful Alyssa Palazzo said, I have to start by talking about me, but I think really when I think about all of us, we're in this business of trying to teach people how to make the world a better place because of something that happened to us in our life. And for me, I was just so lucky. I had two aunts who were social workers, and they became social workers later in life. And one worked at Boston Children's Hospital with severely abused children. The other one was a pioneer, I'm very proud of her, in housing group homes for people with mental illness in the wake of deinstitutionalization. And my dad, who of blessed memory, was in the plumbing supply business. And you're thinking, what does that have to do with social change? And in the 60s and 70s, he had his own strategy of hiring people who were recently released from prison to work for him in his warehouse. And it's a long and beautiful story, which I'm happy to tell you sometime, but later on when he needed professional help, a lot of those guys had become successful and were able to return the favor to him. So it was really wonderful to see. The 10 steps originated when I became the head of a statewide association of community development corporations in Massachusetts. And at the time, I knew a lot about how to run a nonprofit corporation, but I didn't know anything about lobbying. So I did what most of us do under these circumstances. I learned from colleagues, and then I made the rest of it up. And lo and behold, I became a pretty successful lobbyist at the city, state, and federal level. Fast forward, I became the founder of a nonprofit academic program at the University of San Diego, and I decided to teach a course on lobbying to my students. It was called, and it is called, Advocacy, Skills, and Strategies. And I've been teaching that course for 20 years. And what's exciting about the course, and I remember the first time I taught it, I said to the students, okay, your assignment for the semester is to pass a law. And they started laughing. And I said, no, I'm serious. That is what we're going to do. That's what we're going to try to do. And they weren't successful that first year, but in subsequent years, many, many students have been successful. And the students work in teams. They work in groups of 3 to 5, normally 5, and they construct an original lobbying campaign using the 10 steps. And one of the things that I think you will find as exciting and as rewarding as I do is empowering students to do this work. My students, for example, passed a bill extending housing subsidies for foster youth from the age of 18 to the age of 26. That's remarkable. So foster youth in the state of California are benefiting because of the work of my students. And there are 4 case studies in the book, 3 of which have been written by students, of how they use this model to pass laws. And it's breathtaking and rewarding. I find in terms of the course design, it's helpful to have a former legislator come in for guest lectures, accompany students on their lobbying visits, guide them through the process. You know, I want to say too that in terms of the design elements, you don't have to be an expert in how the legislative process works and understand all the nuances of it. You can teach this course really knowing what you know, which is how to be organized and do good research and all about social movements, and those skills that you already have will enable you to teach this course. So the readings, and you can see this from the sample syllabi that are attached, talk about the role of social workers and nonprofit organizations in passing historically significant laws. There is a lot of information about current political movements. I cannot believe that we are going through voting rights all over again. It's such a nightmare, but there's historic information about that, as well as touches on some of the things that are happening currently. There is a chapter that's dedicated to a cook's tour of understanding government finance. And Tracy Gordon, who many of you might know, who's at the Urban and Brookings Tax Policy Center, was my wing woman on this chapter. And the reason that it's important to include is because almost every single type of legislation is going to have a price tag that is attached to it. And particularly if you're lobbying at the local level and the state level, the students need to understand that the money needs to come from somewhere, and they need to be able to make cogent arguments to the legislators about possible sources of funding for their idea. And of course, you know, the course includes theoretical articles about lobbying, meta-analysis of lobbying studies, all kinds of fun and interesting readings. Again, as a faculty member, you can guide the students through the 10 steps of constructing this campaign. The goal of the course is, the way that I have designed it, is for the students to construct a campaign that's based upon an original idea that they have. Many of them are affiliated in one way or another with a nonprofit corporation, and because they're working in teams, there's generally 1 or 2 students in a team who have an idea that they want to advance. The end point of the course is when students hopefully find a legislator who will agree to author a bill or an ordinance on their behalf. Now, obviously, not all the students are successful in doing that, but if they are, and you'll be surprised at how many are, then they can continue on either with an independent study. Sometimes they just do it on their own. In the process of putting together their campaign, they will have formed a coalition, so they can hand it off to a coalition member. So there are all kinds of ways that the project can maintain momentum beyond the course. So just as a simple starting point, and I'm pretty sure you all know this, but it is 100% legal for 501c3 corporations to lobby. And I know sometimes the rules can seem a little bit intimidating and confusing. There's a rules chapter in the book that I hope is super clear and easy to follow. And in addition, there's a slide deck that I put together that explains the lobbying rules for 501c3 corporations in very easy to understand ways. Okay, so let's talk about the 10-step framework. And these are the 10 steps. And of course, I think you know I'm a recovering academic, but when I was within the academy, I did a lot of work working with other researchers to validate the steps, and so I've done some writing on them. So we're going to go through each of these steps, and these are the steps that the students will follow throughout the course to construct their campaign. Oh, one word of warning. The steps are more like dance steps than they are stair steps. It's more like doing a little bit of salsa because they're not necessarily linear. Sometimes the students will complete a step and then they'll have to go back and revisit it. So it's an iterative process as they go through the 10 steps. Okay. So step number 1 is identifying the issue. And sometimes the issue is very obvious and there's data for it. So for example, one campaign that my students worked on was to include pets as part of domestic violence restraining orders. And the way they knew this was an issue is because two of them worked for a domestic violence organization, and they were receiving calls from people who did not want to leave their abuser because the abuser was threatening to kill their pet. And so in that case, they had basically anecdotal data that was coming from their people who were answering the calls. But I think, as you all know, sometimes, you know, as social workers, as professionals, we make assumptions about the most important issue that our clients are facing. And what I try to tell the students is to make sure that the issue that you've identified is really the most important issue for the clients. Once in a while, like recently, there are issues that are so evident because there's a community-wide outcry that we all know what the issues are, and there has been a slew of wonderful legislation that has resulted recently from the Black Lives Matter, so banning chokeholds and so forth. But for the most part, the campaigns that the students will be working on, they will have to work to think through what the issue is. The next step that they have to do once they've identified the issue is do a deep dive on researching it. And obviously, you are an expert in this area. They've got to identify studies or reports that document the issue. They may have to do a survey of their clients, or if it's a neighborhood issue, of neighbors. One thing that is really important is for them to do research, and Google, you know, God bless Google, makes it so easy for all of us to find whether a similar law has been passed in another part of the country, you know, in another city in your state, in another state, because that way that bolsters the argument, and the legislative language from those bills can be used to fashion the bill that the student is working on. And again, as I mentioned earlier, just what would it cost to implement this idea, or how could it be implemented? So, for example, if students were working on a campaign to prohibit smoking in apartment buildings that had 10 or more units, there are costs to implement that kind of law, right? So notices have to go out to landlords, notices have to go out to tenants, there has to be someone or some group of people who go out to check for violations of the law when they receive complaints. So it's probably not a high cost issue, but it needs money to pay for it, to promote it. And so obvious things might be maybe a small real estate added tax on apartment buildings as a way to pay for that kind of information dissemination and enforcement. So they don't have to become budget experts, but they just have to be aware that things do cost money. And I always tell students it's so important to put a face on it. So, you know, going back to the example I gave you about the pets with restraining orders, you want to have testimony from people who have been affected by the issue, who can speak to their experiences with it. And this is an important part of the research, is identifying those particular kinds of stakeholders. How are we doing so far? Any questions? Feel free to pipe up if I'm going too fast or things aren't clear.
Hi, Pat. So I do think we have one question for you. So let's say a student approaches you, the instructor, with an idea for an issue that, you know, they want to try to have a law passed for, you know, and let's say, you know, as an instructor, you just don't feel like you know enough about that issue. I mean, how do you sort of approach, you know, vetting that issue? And even from a grading standpoint, how do you grade this work if you feel like you don't know enough about the topic at hand?
Well, at the end, I'm going to talk all about the grading criteria, and you will know about the topic because the students are going to be doing so much research on it, and they're going to be presenting that research to you. So they'll be educating you at the same time that they're educating themselves. What students, when they bring an issue to me, I just try to use my best judgment to think out loud about it to see if it makes sense. I mean, this past semester, it was really interesting because I had a group of students who were very passionate about working on allowing doulas to be paid for through Medi-Cal payments. And I listened to them. One worked for Planned Parenthood, and it sounded logical, and they did research on it. I wasn't totally convinced it was going to fly and it was going to be a great idea. And what I didn't know was that simultaneously there was a group that was working on getting midwives paid for through Medi-Cal. So it turned out that the doula bill wasn't as important as the midwife bill, but I didn't know that. But that's okay. It's all a learning process. I mean, when you have a group of students, not every group is going to be successful, but the fact that they can go through the steps, identify what their community feels like is the right issue, do the deep dive on the research and keep going, that's the important thing. They get the experience of lobbying, they get the experience of putting together a campaign, and when they become nonprofit professionals, then they know how to do it. And I'm so proud. This is the second edition of this book. And I hear from students all the time that say, my book is dog-eared. I need to get a new copy because, they graduated 10 or 15 years ago and they're still referring to it and using it as professionals. So it's very rewarding. But sometimes it can take several weeks for them to land on a good issue. So you need to allow for that time early on in the semester for them to have that germination process.
And Pat, we have sort of a similar question to what you were just talking about with working through the issue. One instructor wants to know how long the students are working on this issue, sort of what's the length of the semester, what's the number of credits. And this instructor loves this approach. It's difficult to envision students becoming educated enough on an issue and being able to do all of these steps in just one semester. This instructor says that her student projects cross several semesters and new students usually have to step in. And she's wondering if you've ever handled anything like that.
It's great if you can arrange it. I have taught it in an unusual format, and I have the advantage of being the academic director of the whole degree program, so I could move things around with a lot of flexibility. And so what I did was I started the course in the fall, and I ended it in January because in California, the legislature meets and considers new bills in January. So I was a little out of the box in how I designed it. What I do during this course is I'm very, very, very light on other kinds of writing assignments. I ask for very brief individual assignments, and most of the work is done in teams on this research. It's a lot of work for students, but they are so excited about doing something that's real and can make an impact that they're willing to do it. But I think the longer you can make the course, the better. And if you can make it, 2 semesters, even better, because then they'll have more time to hopefully do the implementation after they find an author for their bill. And you can always move the teams around too. Mm-hmm.
And I'll just ask you one more question before we move on. So one instructor on the webinar asks, so the endpoint for sort of this course is the introduction of the legislation and not the actual passage of it. And
exactly.
He said that, yeah, in his state, the state legislature meets from January to April. So it'd probably be ideal to have the class in the fall so that, everything's ready for the spring.
That's correct. That's exactly how you can do it. And the other thing that I've done is a couple of years ago, and I found this worked well, I did a small intro session in August for just like an hour, just saying, this is what the course looks like. This is what you're going to do. The students are all excited. This is really good to do too at new student orientation. And to say, as you're thinking about coming into the course, you need to do some hard, serious thinking about what issue you would want to advance. So that kind of gets their wheels turning. And not all of them are going to come into the course with an idea, but again, because they're working in teams, and generally of 5, and the teams just coalesce around the ideas, around the issue ideas, there are enough students that will have viable ideas. All right, so I guess, Alyssa, you want me to keep going and then we'll stop again. How's that?
Yeah, let's keep going and we'll stop again. And we'll also have time for more questions at the end.
Okay, great, yes. But feel free to pipe up with questions as we go along. All right, so the first step was identifying the issue. Then they're doing all of this research on it. And then they're going to boil that research down into a fact sheet. And it's a single piece of paper that is double-sided. I'm going to show you an example in a minute. And the fact sheet is the storyboard that the students will use when they meet with legislators and legislative aides. And it's so funny because, you know, we're all walking around with these things these days, but you just need a piece of paper to guide the conversation and to lay out the argument in a very concise way. So here is an example from one of my student-led campaigns. I think it's chapters 9 and 10 in the book. And this was a registry to list caregivers of people with developmental disabilities who had been abusive to them. And I had a student who worked in an organization that served people with developmental disabilities, and she would go through this long and involved process where she would write up a staff member for abuse, like pulling someone's hair or giving them a bath in cold water. And she'd be at a meeting at another agency a month later, and she would find the person employed by that agency. And she was furious. And she said, you know, there are registries for people who work with children. There are registries who work with the elderly. Why aren't the developmentally disabled population protected? So she convinced a group of classmates to participate with her on putting together this campaign. This is the front side of the fact sheet, and hopefully you can see it clearly on your computer. Again, it's in the book. So a lot of the artifacts, the fact sheets and other artifacts are in the book, so students can use them as models. And you can see they did a lovely job laying out the problem, the solution. It's nice graphically. And then on the back, they identified other states with, hopefully you can see my little pointer here, with registries that are similar to the ones that my students proposed. They're coalition members, even though we haven't gotten to the coalition yet. The references, right, because they've gone through all that deep dive on their literature, they've got to reference it, and of course their contact information for their campaign. So, you know, I say that this step is creating a fact sheet, but it actually is creating two documents. So one is a fact sheet, and the second is a position paper that is the broader amalgamation of the research. So it's the research, the charts, the graphs, if you've done data, if you have testimonials from people who've been affected by the issue. It has, if there were similar measures passed in other places, it has copies of that language, that bill language, and the list of coalition members. And as you can tell, as I'm talking about the dance steps and going back and forth, you know, we haven't even gotten to the coalition stage yet. So all of this, again, it's like dance steps, and it builds on one another. So they're going to start with a draft of the fact sheet and a draft of the position paper, and those documents will continue to evolve throughout the semester. And then we get to branding the issue. And again, they branded as REACH, the Registry to End Abusive Caregiver Hiring, because it's a lot shorter to say when you're calling a legislator. But ideally, and I talk extensively about this in the book, they want to figure out a way to name and frame the issue so that it will hopefully have an impact on any opposition. And, you know, I've just given you 3 simple examples here of what I feel are very good names and frames for issues. I mean, if you think about the death tax, look what that's done to inheritance tax laws in the United States. It's been extraordinary. Living wage is a more positive example, but there are so many ways that the students have to think creatively about how they're going to name their issue, ideally so that it provides a frame as well. Okay, the next step, which is 5, so we're halfway there, is to map out supporters and detractors, and they're going to do this on 2 levels. The first level is I ask them to create a very, very, very simple map. Who do we think is going to be on our side? So what other organizations will be members and join our coalition and help us lobby on this? Who do we think is in the middle? And who might be opposed to us? That simple mapping is really important because a lot of times the students can't imagine in their wildest dreams who's going to be opposed to their idea. And I always tell them to call a family member who they have political disagreements with, and that person will think of some ideas. But it's really a great way for them to look at the universe and think about the fact that not everyone will agree with them, and to try to anticipate the arguments that the opponents will make to their idea.
Pat?
I'm sorry.
I just have an audience question that I thought would be
Sure.
a good one for you. So
Sure.
this audience member wants to know if we could hear a little bit about your process of self-reflection when students pick an issue that's very ideologically divergent from like your own perspectives. And like, in my head as like an editor, I'm thinking like, oh, if they pick something really right wing and you're really left wing or something like that.
It's funny. I guess I have been lucky because I've never had a student pick an issue that was right wing. So let me just put it out there. I have had students, and this has been so fascinating, who have been right wing students who have worked on teams with other students, and they have been successful in passing a bill. And their perspectives have been enormously helpful to shaping the campaigns. And all the students have learned something in the process of working together. But in my 20 years, I have to say, I've never encountered that. And I don't know if it's because I was teaching nonprofit management. It was a nonprofit master's program as opposed to a political science program where I would have all kinds of views, but that hasn't happened.
And we have like another question that is a little bit tied in. So is there any sort of preparation you have to do to get the students to work in groups of 3 to 5, considering that, they might have very different beliefs?
No, the students what happens is at the beginning of the semester, you say, all right, what ideas are you thinking of? And you just scribble them down. Hopefully we'll be in real classrooms again soon. Just scribble them down on the whiteboard. And then students say, oh, I want to work on that. Oh, or I'm torn. I want to work on this one or that one. And they just naturally form groups that they cluster around these ideas.
That's perfect. Thanks, Pat.
Okay. So going back to this mapping of the supporters and detractors, I always tell students that I want them to look for odd bedfellows. And I know this from my own time as a lobbyist. And I think I said this, when I started teaching this course, I had to reflect, how did I do that? And that's when I wrote up the 10 steps. And I remembered when I was lobbying that I was lobbying principally for affordable housing development funds. And if I went in with just my members who are all affordable housing developers, the legislators always thought that we were self-interested. It was like, oh, it's just those nonprofit people and they're not going to get paid if we don't pass this legislation, which is kind of ironic since the people I worked with were, really doing God's work. So what we learned was that we had to bring in bankers. We had to bring in environmental groups. We had to bring in other organizations that would say, this is a really important issue for redeveloping the health of this community. So the more perspectives, different perspectives, and the broader the based coalition that the students can form, the greater chance they'll have in being able to pass legislation. To give you another example, a group of my students, I'm very proud of them, passed a mandated reporter law for child pornography, and the law had to do with technicians, so computer repair technicians. And they had a lot of opposition at the beginning. They had Best Buy was in opposition to them because they said, what if one of our techs is working on a computer and it's Diane Arbus photos? It's not child pornography, and what are we supposed to do? So they had to spend a lot of time talking with them and negotiating with them and crafting the legislation so that it made sense. And then they were able to form a coalition with community activists and tech companies, and the legislation passed. So, as I said a moment ago, when we are at step 5 in mapping, we're actually at 2 steps. So the first is this broad community map, and the second is mapping out legislators. So if you yourself haven't lobbied, fear not, because let me say one word and you will understand this, and it's committee. The world works according to committees. And if it's a city or a town or a county or a state, the legislators will work in committees, and there'll be fiscal committees and environment committees and justice and etc., healthcare. And it will be fairly easy for your students to look at those committees and figure out where their bill belongs. Occasionally, a bill will be heard in more than one committee, particularly if it's very expensive. It might be heard in an appropriations committee and a subject matter committee. But once the students identify which committees their bill will be heard in, then they do simple internet research to see who sits on those committees, who chairs that committee, where does that person live, and do they have any connections to organizations or people who live in that legislator's community. During this particular process, it's very helpful to ask your retired legislator to come in and help the students if they're having trouble identifying which committee their potential bill will go to. But doing that research is really simple. It's important to find out things like, is the legislature, does the person happen to be a foster parent? And that would make that person more interested in your issue. Or what does that person do for a living? Do they have a background in law enforcement or whatever? So again, because of the internet, it's so easy to find profiles of the legislators. And you'll see, I love this, I included in the book this sheet that my students put together for themselves that had pictures of each of the legislators they were going to lobby and tiny little bios about them. So when they went to meet them, they were prepared and they knew exactly who they were meeting with. Okay, So now we're doing our little salsa and we're building our coalition. And you can tell from everything I've said, when you're doing the mapping, you're thinking about the coalition, right? So it feeds right into this. And the students need to make sure that they have signed agreements from each organization so that you know they're not listing an organization that says, what? I never heard about this campaign. They are going to identify topic experts. Now, your students, you're going to be very proud of them. They are going to become topic experts on this issue because they will have done so much reading about it, the reading that they will have done to create the fact sheet and to synthesize it and to put together the white paper. So they will likely want to testify. And they'll also have, again, if they're individuals who have been directly affected by the issue, have the lived experience, or if there are other professionals in the community who have joined on to their campaign and want to testify, that's really important. And their coalition members will also generate calls and emails and that kind of traffic to legislators. So the coalition members need to understand what is expected of them, and not everyone is going to do the same level of work. And sometimes, you're going to find, oh, I happen to know, a movie star who's going to endorse our campaign. Okay, well, that's nice to get, a big name like that. But a lot of times it's the worker bees that really just get it done. Then the students will create very simple educational materials. And these will be, what do you say when you call a legislator or a city council person or, a county supervisor? What do you write? What's the language? So very simple instructions for that. And then I think my friend John McNutt is on this webinar because he's the expert on this. You're really going to use your social media to promote the message. The kids have to build a website. That's period. They will be very adept at using social media, and I always tell them they've got to really control the message. They will have done, as you know, a lot of previous thinking about branding the campaign, thinking about the opposition arguments. They will know how to move it forward. If they're able to get newspaper and TV coverage, the newspaper coverage, believe it or not, is actually really important, especially if they can get it prior to their visit to meet with legislators, because they can physically bring a copy of what was in print or online. Legislators know the more exposure an issue has, the more pressure that puts on them. So the students are very adept at launching media campaigns, and they've been successful. Should I pause here for a second? Or should I?
Yeah, so we have so many questions coming in, Pat. I can barely keep hold of all of them. So this question goes back a little bit. How do you see the link between testifying in committee, especially outside of session, and trying to get a new bill introduced?
So, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Can you say that again?
Yes. How do you see the link between testifying in committee, especially outside of a session, and trying to get a new bill introduced?
Okay, so they have to, at the beginning of the calendar, they're going to try to find a bill author. The bill author is going to, and I think I'm talking about this later on, the bill author will send the bill language to the legislative council or to some authority who will write up the legislative language. Then there'll be an announcement of the hearings that will take place. And the students will be notified, and this is again happening either in the independent study or the second part of a long course or just on the students by themselves, then the students will go to testify at hearing. Does that answer the question, I hope?
I think it does. And
Okay.
let me ask you some other questions too. So we have one audience member who wants to know, like, their particular state capital is really far away from their school. So can this process be applied to local governance?
Yes.
And then, well, I'll answer that one first, then I'll ask you the other one.
Okay. So I am in sunny San Diego, and my state capital is in Sacramento, which is a plane flight away. And what we did, and we were successful every year, was our students would apply for grants through the Graduate Student Association, and they would give them grants for the plane tickets, which would be great. We also had students who would drive from San Diego up to Sacramento after their bill was authored, so they could testify, and they would go back and forth on their own. And it was funny. This was the pair of students who worked on the extending the housing subsidies for foster youth, and they loathed each other, which was hysterical. So they went on these 8-hour car rides back and forth, but they got the legislation passed. So we have had students work on local campaigns. I really have always insisted that the entire class fly up to Sacramento, at least for the day. So the students who are working on a city issue will still get to see the state capitol and get a tour and be part of helping their classmates, excuse me, lobby, because it's just a very cool experience.
Okay, and let me ask you one more question, then we can keep going. So how do students determine what level of government makes the most sense for their particular issue?
Well, you can help them figure that out.
Okay.
I mean, that's the best answer. Sometimes it depends on how large the issue is. So, for instance, last semester, we had students who were debating whether they should go on a county level or a statewide level. And the issue had to do with Wi-Fi strengthening, I'm not using the right words, but I think you all know what I mean. You know, the Wi-Fi networks in low-income neighborhoods so that everyone could fully participate in school and what have you. And they were going to go statewide, and then they decided to do a pilot in San Diego County because they felt that it was more doable. So sometimes, you know, it's just weighing the pros and cons and seeing what the political landscape is like.
That's perfect. All right, let's keep going.
Okay. So media campaign, we're good. Oh, there we are. Then we're step 9. Yay! And this is the super fun part. So as I already said, the whole class, I like them to go to the state capitol. The students will have made the appointments with their legislative targets in advance, and they will often bring with them members of their coalition, people with a lived experience. They will often have to split their groups because meetings can run longer. I sit in on as many meetings as I can. I ask my retired legislator to come up for the day and give him a stipend and pay for his plane ticket, and he's in glory. And so he gets to give the students a tour of the Capitol. He sits in, doesn't say anything, but sits in on the meetings and gives them feedback. So it's really exciting. And the thing that I find kind of heartbreaking every year is that the students are so prepared. They have their fact sheet, they have their white paper, they have their coalition, they're bringing press coverage many times. And what I always feel kind of sad about is they come and they say, I can't believe they really paid attention to us and they listened to us and they took us seriously, which I think is kind of sad, because of course they should listen to you. And I will say, I should have said this at the beginning, I taught this course to graduate students. I believe very strongly that undergraduates could do it just as well. One of my graduate students who managed to pass a bill called the state legislature Congress. So these kids didn't know their butt from a hole in the wall when they started this. So you can really work with students who this is all brand new to them, and they can succeed, which is, again, it's so exciting for them and for you. And it's, you can teach them. We did practice lobbying before they left. And again, my retired legislator, they lobbied him and he gave them feedback. It's fun. Oh, there they are. Okay. And then, I say monitor progress on the issue. This is the last of the 10 steps. It's really not monitoring the progress. It's really moving the ball down the field. In other words, this assumes that they find someone to author a bill for them. I'm wondering, oh, here's grading. So let's talk about grading, and then I'll stop, and then I'll go into the second part. But the grading is the quality of the fact sheet and the white paper, the ability to engage the coalition, the website and social media strategy, their lobbying effectiveness, regardless of whether or not they secure an author of their bill. I mean, they might not, but that doesn't mean they did a bad job. I used to ask the teams to distribute, and I still do this, 100 points among them. And I would get everyone's sheet, and that would be a good way for me to judge if there were any free riders. And generally there weren't, but if there were, I could mark them down accordingly. And then, as I said, short individual writing assignments, but very short because there's so much work that has to be done throughout this course. So let me stop and take some more questions before I go
on. Okay, let's see what we have here. So one question we have is, how would you guide a group of students that could not find an author for their bill?
How would I guide them? What do you mean? Like, that would, well, basically the course ends. The course is ending there anyway. So what happens is the students in my course fly to Sacramento, they come back, we debrief. They usually don't know that day. They usually have some interest, and then there are calls back and forth for a week or so after that, and then the course ends. So if they haven't found an author, then that's okay.
And this is sort of a similar question. So what do you do when officials don't want to meet with the students and like they won't respond to the students' requests to schedule meetings, they won't answer them?
Oh, that I've never had that happen, ever. Because it might not be the legislator, but it might be a legislative aide. You can also, if you live far from the Capitol, you can make some appointments in the local legislative district offices. There are pros and cons to doing that. The pros are it's local. You don't have to schlep anywhere. The cons are that the policy people are at the state capitol. They're not local. So unless you have a policy person who happens to be in town, then you can feed two birds with one hand. But I always tell the students not to be disappointed if they are not meeting with the legislator himself or herself, because the legislative aides play an enormous role in working with the students and the legislators and stewarding this effort all across the board. But I've never had a situation where students had difficulty securing appointments, and quite the opposite. The students say, we have all these appointments, how are we going to get to them all in one day? We have to have a strategy for who's going to meet with whom.
And then I'll do one more. So typically, what sort of length are you looking for with the position papers that the students write?
I would say about 8 to no more than 15 pages rather. It depends on the white papers, the position papers. The legislator who authors the bill is going to depend on that information, and they're going to draw on it quite heavily. So you want to give that person the salient facts, the persuasive arguments, and the information they need to be able to move this forward.
Mm-hmm. And then Pat, I just want to let you know we have about 15 minutes left. Do you want to keep taking questions now or keep going forward with slides?
I only have a few more slides. So what I wanted to do is just talk about, like, if it's an independent study, what to expect. It's pretty short.
Yeah, let's do slides first.
Okay, so as I mentioned, the legislative aid, they will present the roadmap to the students. They'll say, okay, folks, there's going to be a committee hearing on this date. And then the students say, okay, how are we going to get there? Who's going to get there? What kind of, how do we activate the coalition and get them to make calls into all the legislators who are on that committee and so forth. So again, this is where you, as a faculty member, you really don't have to know that much, because the legislative aid will be that guide for you. The students, what they need to do is they have to make sure that the bill or the ordinance, that language reflects their intent. And you'll see there's a chapter in the book that's really heartbreaking where it didn't, and the bill didn't get passed. So it's, even though you have these professionals, they're, for the most part, I believe they're attorneys, at least they are in this state, who write the bill language, the students still have to read it to make sure it reflects their intent. The students, as I said, they're going to have to write and generate letters to members of the committee. They're going to have to testify and bring others to testify. They're going to have to write thank you letters, generate press, activate the coalition, do the same thing if you live in a state other than Nebraska that has 2 chambers, or if you're working on a state level as opposed to a city level, you know, you have to do the same thing on both sides. And then write letters to the governor to make sure that if the bill passes, it doesn't get vetoed, as happened with one of my students, and it was heartbreaking. So that's the route. So now let's open it up for more questions from our skinny little duck.
Fabulous. Okay. So one instructor has written in and noted that appointment scheduling has been really difficult with COVID and members and staff taking meetings remotely. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the students just have to be, because I dealt with that this past semester, the students just have to be organized and persistent, and they need to divide up the work in a way that makes sense and just be kind of cheerful and on it.
Got it. And this is going back to something we talked about halfway through the presentation, but when you're having students set up websites for their issues, what kind of websites, you know, should they be setting up? Are these like Facebook pages? Are they websites via WordPress? Like, what kind of style?
Whatever they want. If it's a Facebook page, that's fine. whatever works for them and whatever they want to do.
Mhm. And then we have an instructor asking whether or not you've ever taught this course across 2 semesters rather than just one, and if so, how that worked out for you.
No, I've only taught it in the one unusual semester, from the September to January, and then offer the independent study. And I found that that works well because, again, if the students don't have an author for their bill, the class is over. Now, you could teach it across 2 semesters with the understanding that if students weren't successful in getting an author, that they would join other teams.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So here's another question. Did the students have any advantages using technology to build coalitions? And in parentheticals, was it any easier to build those community relationships that way?
Yes and no. They found by looking at, for instance, when they did the research on whether or not other states had passed similar legislation, they could see who they could contact, those grassroots organizations who had been responsible, see who was on their coalition maps, get ideas for local players, and they could also identify national groups. But the national groups really don't have a lot of weight when it's a state or a local issue. They did attract new people through social media, tweeting about their campaign and asking people to join and sign up. I am not a big fan of petitions because I don't think they're very effective lobbying tools, but if students wanted to do that, they could do that. So mostly they identified the coalitions through their mapping and then through their own networks and reached out to them that way.
So this instructor asks, do you have sample grading matrices for the various activities or assignments in your book? And I do want to note that we do have 2 sample syllabi that are attached as handouts to this webinar, just for everyone on the call.
Yes, and there are 2 in the syllabus that I put up. There are several grading matrix that are in that syllabus. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'll just add, because I didn't mention this at the beginning of the presentation, that in addition to the 2 syllabi that we have as downloads, we also have 2 PowerPoint lecture outlines that you could give to your students as lectures in your course.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I was going to say, one, as I said earlier, explains the lobbying rules for nonprofit corporations, and the other talks about, it's a real summary of the legislative process and the 10 steps.
Perfect. And then I have a question here about the position paper. This instructor is wondering how it's typically structured, if you sort of give guidelines for that.
There are samples in the book. So there are a few samples that students can use. No, I just want it to be logical. So I don't say it has to follow this particular format.
And then I actually have a few people asking if we can remind them about your book. So I think this would be a great chance to go to the next slide and tell them, what we have. So Pat is the author of the Lobbying Strategy Handbook, 10 Steps to Advancing Any Cause Effectively. We just came out with the 2nd edition in the fall, so it's ready to be purchased. And if you go to our website, you can request a free instructor examination copy. You can also just email me, alyssa.palazzo@oup.com. I would be happy to help set you up with an examination copy for your class. Pat also put together some resources that we have available on Oxford Learning Link, which is our free platform at Oxford where we house all of our instructor and student materials that accompany our books. And, you know, we have the sample syllabi that are also available via this webinar. We have videos, handouts, resources, tons of great things to help you guys set up your class. And I want to thank everyone for coming and spending your afternoon for us. Thank you, Pat, for being willing to give this lecture. I think that this was so much fun, and I know I even learned a lot, and I've read the book, so phenomenal. And if there are any additional questions that people have that you think of later, just feel free to shoot me an email, and I'll pass it along to Pat.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I just wanted to say one thing about the book. I know this is an intimidating topic for people, so I've written it in a way that's light and a little funny. And as I said, there are chapters that are authored by my students, which is really exciting because I think your students will be able to relate to seeing these campaigns and how the students use the 10 steps to pass these incredible laws. It's very exciting.
Wonderful. And I have a lot of people now coming in with questions asking me for my email address. I've just put it in the chat right there. And if you don't want to email me personally for an examination copy, again, you can always request one on our website. So thank you again, everyone, for coming. And with that, we're going to sign off.
Great.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.